Welcome to this video where we are going to talk about grief. We've been looking at a scale of emotions which ranges from the very low negative emotions, unconscious states of being, all the way up to the highest states of emotion or the highest states of being, where we experience love and peace and freedom. However, before we can get there, if we're on this journey of letting go, we need to let go of each layer of negativity that holds us back from that. And what's amazing is each and every one of us, our true selves, is already like that. Love, peace, joy, these are our deepest states. But it's kind of like the clouds that cover the sky and block the sunlight from shining through. It's like the real us is that sun, is that radiant sun. But because of programming, because of what's being handed down to us, because of what we've chosen at some point in the past in order to have an experience, or other attachments that we've got a junk to surrender, to release before we can access those deeper states, before we can be and really experience those deeper states. So this is going to be a powerful episode. I'm reading pretty well word for word from the book Letting Go by David Hawkins. If you're someone who has a lot of suppressed grief, which is most people, I know that this has been me and I've been working through this myself, this episode is going to help enormously. So get ready for a powerful chapter. Grief is an experience common to us all. In grief, we feel that things are too difficult. We'll never make it. We are unloving and unlovable. We have thoughts such as, all the years I've wasted. It's a feeling of sadness and loss, loneliness, the feeling of if only, regret, feelings of abandonment, pain, helplessness and hopelessness, anguish, nostalgia, melancholy, depression, longing, irretrievable loss, heartbrokenness, disappointment, and pessimism. Grief can be precipitated by the loss of a belief system. I experienced that. The loss of a relationship, a capacity or a role, a job, a hope about ourselves, or an overall attitude towards life, external circumstances or institutions. It's the feeling, I'll never get out of this. This one is too difficult. I tried, but nothing helps. There's a feeling of vulnerability to pain and suffering, and so we see a great deal of it in the external world to reinforce and justify our own inner feeling. There's a crying for someone to help because we can't do anything about it, and we feel that maybe someone else can do it for us. This is in contradistinction to apathy, where there is a feeling that no one can help. So, as you would have heard in the last episode, apathy keeps us in that feeling like there's no hope at all. Grief, we move the level higher, and at least we believe that maybe someone else can do it for us. So we're getting into that higher energy state. Allowing the grief. Most of us carry a great deal of suppressed grief. Men especially are prone to hide that particular feeling, as it's considered unmanly and unmasculine to cry. Most people are afraid of the amount of grief they have suppressed. They're terrified that they will be swamped and overwhelmed by it. People will say, if I was ever to start crying, I would never stop. There's so much grief in the world. Grief in my life, grief in my family and my friends. Oh, the untold tragedies of life. All of the disappointments and smashed hopes. Suppressed grief is responsible for many psychosomatic conditions and health-related complaints. Instead of suppressing the feeling, if it's allowed to come up and to be relinquished, we can quickly jump from grief to acceptance. The continuing grief over a loss is due to the resistance to accepting that state and allowing the grief to expend itself. The persistence of a feeling is due to the resistance to allowing it to be relinquished. For example, cry me a river. Once we accept that fact that we can handle grief, we've already moved up into pride. We've jumped up several levels of energy. The feeling of I can do it and I can handle it brings us to courage. With the courage to face our inner feelings and let them go, we thus move on to the levels of acceptance and eventually peace. When we let go of a lot of grief we've been holding over the years, our friends and family will notice a change in our facial expression. Our step will be lighter and we will look younger. Grief is time limited. This fact gives us the courage and willingness to face the grief. If we don't resist the feeling of grief and totally surrender to it, it will run out in about 10 to 20 minutes. Then it will stop for variable lengths of time. If we keep surrendering to it every time it comes up, then it will eventually run out. We just allow ourselves to experience it fully. We only have to tolerate an overwhelming grief for 10 to 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden it will disappear. If we resist the grief, then it will go on and on. Suppressed grief can go on for years. I find that so amazing that if we just let ourselves experience a surge of grief, then it pretty well leaves our system in 10 to 20 minutes. There'll be parts of it that hang around for small amounts of time, but as we keep surrendering it, we can completely move out of this level into the level above. In facing grief, we often have to acknowledge and let go of our shame and embarrassment about having the feeling in the first place. For men, this is especially so. We have to relinquish our fear of the feeling and our fear of being swamped and overwhelmed by it. It helps to realize that letting go of the resistance to the feeling moves us quickly through it. Traditionally, women have said out of their own experience and wisdom, "A good cry makes me feel better." Many a man has been surprised when he learned the truth of this. Experientially, there was the surprising and almost immediate relief from a pounding headache as soon as the grief about a past situation was allowed to come up. As the grief surfaced, there was the sentence, "Men don't cry." After letting go of the masculine pride about crying, then up came a fear that the crying would never stop once it was allowed to start. As soon as that fear was gone, there was anger. It was anger at a society that forces men to suppress their feelings, and anger at the notion that men are not even supposed to have feelings. With the letting go of that anger, a level of courage was reached, and then the needed crying could be allowed. Not only was there relief from the headache, but when the torrent of sobs subsided, a profound peacefulness settled. Henceforth, the subject did not have to be avoided. When we surrender, we don't have to be at the effect of our suppressed feelings anymore. We can actually be the one who is free. We're not reacting to our suppressed feelings. Once a man has fully let the grief come up and totally freed himself from that suppressed energy, he's peaceful and his view of his own masculinity changes. He realizes that his masculinity is now more complete. He's still just as much of a man, but now he's a man who can also be in touch with and handle his own feelings. Consequently, he's more adequate, more capable, more well-rounded, more understanding, more mature, more capable of relating to and understanding others, more compassionate and more loving. The psychological basis of all grief and mourning is attachment. Attachment and dependence occur because we feel incomplete within ourselves. Therefore, we seek objects, people, relationships, places, and concepts to fulfill our inner needs. Because they're all unconsciously utilized to fulfill an inner need, they come to be identified as mine, my concept, my relationship. As more energy is poured into them, there's a transition from identifying with the external objects as mine to being an actual extension of me. Loss of the object or person is experienced as a loss of our own self and an important part of our emotional economy. loss is experienced as a diminution of the quality of ourselves, which that object or person represented. Isn't it crazy that we can be so attached to a car or a piece of clothing or a person that unconsciously we equate them, that thing, as that's me, and the losing of that thing is like, oh shit, I'm losing part of myself. And that's the nature of attachment. Attachment creates a dependency. I'll go back. The more emotional energy invested in the other object or person, the greater will be the feeling of loss and the greater the pain associated with the undoing of the bonds of dependence. Attachment creates a dependency, and dependency, because of its nature, intrinsically carries with it a fear of loss. Within each person, there's the child, the parent, and the adult. When grief comes up, it's rewarding to ask, within myself, is the child, the parent, or the adult that's the source of this feeling? For example, the child within a person is scared that something will happen to a beloved dog. It wonders, how will I make it? The inner adult also feels grief, but the adult accepts the inevitable. The little kitty or doggy is not immortal. The adult in us regretfully accepts that impermanency is a part of life. We accept that our youth is not permanent, that many romantic relationships aren't lifelong, and that our dog will one day die. Handling loss. Because of the nature of attachment, the first state preceding the actual experience of loss is that of fear of loss. This is usually defended in one of two ways. One is to increase the intensity of the attachment by ever persistent attempts to strengthen those bonds. This approach is based on the fantasy that the greater the bond, the less likelihood of loss. However, this is the very maneuver that often precipitates loss in personal relationships because the other person struggles to be free of the possessive attachment and the amount of restrictive control they feel being placed upon them. Thus, because what we hold in mind tends to manifest, the fear of a loss can paradoxically be the mechanism of bringing that loss about. The more we try to cling to that person, the more they try and avoid us. The second way that fear of loss is handled is by the psychological mechanism of denial, which is, in common language, called playing ostrich. We see this around every day in its various forms of refusing to face the inevitable. All the warning signs are there, but the person just doesn't take heed. Thus, the man who's obviously in the process of losing his job tends not to notice. The partners in a marriage that's going down the drain take no corrective action. The person with a serious disease ignores all the symptoms and avoids medical attention. The politicians fail to look at social problems, hoping that they'll go away. Whole countries are oblivious to the precarious state of existence, for example, the 9/11 attack. The motorist ignores the ominous warning signals of a misbehaving engine. We've all experienced regret that we didn't pay attention to the warning signals of trouble ahead. To handle the fear of loss, we have to look at what purpose the external personal object serves in our life. What emotional need is being fulfilled? What emotions would arise if we were to lose the object or the person? Loss can be anticipated, and we can handle the various fears associated with the sense of loss by disassembling the emotional complexes that they represent and letting go of the individual component feelings. This is a common theme in letting go, is all these big scary things that threaten our sense of safety and security and our ego basically can be broken down. Like, for example, if you're going to lose a job, you can break that fear of I'm going to lose a job down into its component parts and start surrendering the individual parts. Thus, you can let go of huge emotional things. Like, you might think, oh, I've got way too much trauma for this to work for me, or I've had this fear forever, or this is just part of who I am. That's all stories. You can use this method to break down some of the deepest, most intractable seeming issues, emotional issues or fears or doubts or anything. It's very, very powerful just by breaking it down like this. Let's say, for example, you have a pet dog to which you've been attached for many years. It's obvious that old Rover, the dog, is getting older. You find that you don't like to think about his advanced age, feeling uncomfortable at the prospect of his death, and you put it out of mind. As you catch yourself doing this, you realize that these feelings are warning signals and that you're not handling the emotional situation. And so you ask yourself, what purpose is this dog serving in my life? What is his emotional service to me? You can do this in your relationships as well. Love, companionship, devotion, amusement, diversion, distraction. Will losing the dog leave these personal emotional needs unfulfilled? In looking at this, some of the fear can be acknowledged and relinquished. Once the fear is let go, you don't have to resort to denial and pretend to yourself that Rover will live forever. Rover's going to die. Another emotion associated with grief and mourning is that of anger. The loss of that which is important frequently brings up a feeling of rage, which may be projected out onto the world, society, individuals, and ultimately God, who is held to be responsible for the nature of the universe. Anger results from prior refusal to accept the fact that all relationships and possessions in this life are transitory. Even the physical body, which is our biggest attachment, eventually has to be relinquished, as everyone is aware. And the mind also. We feel that what has become important or comforting to us is a permanent attachment. Consequently, when that illusion is threatened, there's anger, resentment, and self-pity, feelings which can result in chronic bitterness. This is often the root of bitterness. Impotent rage is associated with a desire to change the nature of the world and the impossibility of doing so. In facing this fact of existence, a major loss can therefore bring about a shift in our philosophical position. One major loss can awaken us to the nature of all attachments and all relationships, or we may again deny the obvious fact that all relationships are transitory and furiously re-intensify existing bonds to compensate for the loss. A part of handling denial of the inevitability of loss is seeing through attempts at manipulation. In fantasy, the mind tries to develop tactics so as to avoid the loss. This may take the form of becoming gooder or more hardworking, more honest, more persevering, more loyal. In religious persons, this may take the form of trying to manipulate God by promises and bargains. In relationships, it may take the form of overcompensatory behavior. The spouse becomes ever more dutiful, loving, and attentive in an attempt to prevent a breakup. The inattentive husband suddenly starts bringing home gifts and flowers instead of getting to the root cause of the problem, which is that suppressed grief. When the denial breaks down, the manipulations haven't worked and the fear has been passed through, then the depression itself, the actual process of mourning and grief, can take place. All of these emotional stages can be worked through much more rapidly by the process of letting go, in which the inevitability of the emotion of grief is surrendered and replaced by a willingness to let go of resistance and let the process pass through and complete itself. It's the same for all these different stages, the same exact process. Relaxing your resistance to the feeling and letting it come up, letting yourself feel it. There can be a decision to let go of resisting the grief. Instead of denial and resistance, you plunge into it, which is very frowned upon in our society. In a lot of cases where we're just encouraged to, get on with it, don't mope. However, if we plunge into the depth of that grief, and we're not there so we can get sympathy or so we can just pity ourselves, but we're there so we can experience the depths of that grief. This is how we can get through it very rapidly. You have a good old cry over Rover or the lost relationship. Associated with the feeling of grief is always, it says, a variable amount of guilt. This is based on the fantasy that the loss represents a punishment or that A different attitude or behavior would have prevented it from happening. And it's very common for children to do this, but adults are just big children. Unless it's relinquished, the guilt can then recycle and refuel the anger and rage. The unacknowledged and unrelinquished rage can be projected onto others in the environment in the form of blame. We looked at blame in the last video. Blame projected onto other relationships may then compound the loss by bringing about further loss. So if you don't let go of this emotion, it can just spread. This happens frequently between marital partners as a result of the death of a child. It's been reported that the divorce rate among parents who've lost children is as high as 90%. Because of the projection of blame, a severe loss is then compounded by another severe loss, that of a marital partner. An example of this type of reaction is the case of a 40-year-old woman. She had an excellent marriage for 20 years with an attentive, dutiful husband. Her youngest son then developed leukemia. When he died, she went into grief and mourning, and more importantly, developed a rage reaction. It took the form of hatred. She hated the doctors, she hated the hospital, she hated God, she hated her husband and the existing children. Her rage became so uncontrollable that she became physically violent and threatening. Several times the police had to be called to control her violent behavior. Finally, the other children left home out of fear of the chaos, physical abuse, and menacing emotional states. Her husband left no stone unturned in trying to help her with the rage. Clearly didn't know about letting go. But she vented her fury upon him as well, violently attacking him on several occasions. Finally, in desperation and despair, he was driven from the home too. The chaotic situation ultimately ended in divorce, in which the woman lost her home. It was almost 5 years before the rage subsided, at which time the woman had destroyed her whole life and now had to start over from scratch, rebuilding a new life. When all the negative emotions have been worked through, surrendered to, and let go of, relief finally occurs, and the former suffering is replaced by acceptance. Acceptance is different from resignation. Two different things here. In resignation, there are still residuals of the previous emotion left. There is reluctance and a delaying of the true recognition of the facts. Resignation says, I don't like it, but I have to put up with it. Still that emotion in there. With acceptance, resistance to the true nature of the facts has been relinquished. Thus, one of the signs of acceptance is serenity. With acceptance, the struggle is over and life begins anew. The energies that were bound up in the previous negative emotion are now freed up so that the healthier aspects of the personality are now re-energized. The creative aspect of the mind develops opportunities for new life situations and further options for growth and experience, accompanied by a new sense of aliveness. A well-known and widely practiced teaching is the serenity prayer of the 12-step groups. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Failure to work through any of the various emotions associated with mourning and loss can result in chronic stuckness. If you've ever asked yourself, why am I stuck? Why do I feel so stuck? This can be the root of it. Failure to work through any of those stages of mourning and loss. Because basically your mind is always seeking to feel that sense of wholeness and completion. And if you have skipped over or glossed over a period of life where you haven't allowed yourself to grieve and feel that mourning, it's like your mind's always looking for more opportunities for you to get that out, because the unconscious mind's primary drive is towards wholeness and survival. So stuckness is unconsciously you refusing to move forward until you've felt that grief, until you've let it go. Thus, again, suppressed grief can result in prolonged depression, prolonged states of denial in which the death of the person is actually denied. Chronic guilt or refusal to work through the emotions associated with loss can result in delayed grief reaction and physical disease. This is where it starts to manifest in our body, because the mind goes, well, you're not listening to me, conscious mind, So I have no choice but to start expressing this in physical symptoms so that you can pay attention to this thing. The mechanisms behind this process are explained in a later chapter on the relationship between mind and body, so we're going to dive deep into that stuff, don't worry. Suppressed energy of the unrelinquished emotions re-emerges through the body's endocrine and nervous systems as an energetic imbalance, which impairs the flow of life energy through the body's acupuncture meridians. This results in pathologic changes in various organs. It's a well-known fact that the death rate among the bereaved is much higher than that of the general population, especially in the first year or two following the death of a spouse. One source of grief-related guilt is anger at the loved one for departing. This is often suppressed because it seems irrational to the conscious mind. The virtues of the departed loved one are enhanced and exaggerated in fantasy, and this discrepancy compounds the guilt. Start to play them up as to what sort of person they were, and they never did anything wrong. How could they possibly go? And I'm angry at them, so I feel guilt as well. But why? Because they're perfect. How could we be angry at such a wonderful person? There's guilt about being angry at God, the author of the universe, for having allowed the tragic event to take place. Even if that's an unconscious. God is one of the archetypes of the unconscious mind that all human beings have. We all have some deep idea about if there was a God, it might be a little something like this, and we have that anger. We have guilt about being angry at God a lot of the time when we're stuck in grief. A 60-year-old woman came into the office with multiple physical complaints. She had asthma attacks, allergies, bronchitis, frequent episodes of pneumonia, and all kinds of breathing difficulties. During psychotherapy, it was revealed that her mother had died 22 years previously, and she stated that, curiously, she had no reaction to her mother's death. Oddly, although it was her responsibility, she had not ordered a headstone to be placed on her mother's grave. From information given, it was obvious that she had had an extremely dependent relationship with her mother, about whom she was ambivalent because of the mother's refusal to fill all of her dependency needs. It took many months for her to work through her massive denial, which was associated with guilt over her anger at the mother for leaving her. These emotions just stack up one on top of the other. That's why it's so important that if you want to be free from your own negativity, go through this process. Go through it thoroughly. The anger was directed inwardly at herself in the form of disease, which also expressed her helplessness and her wish to cry out for her mother. The suppressed desire to cry for the mother loss led to a constant feeling that she couldn't breathe. She hated herself for the love-hate feelings for her mother, and the sum total of all her repressed emotions had re-emerged in the form of her multiple respiratory symptoms and complaints, psychosomatic illness, essentially. As she worked through the delayed mourning, the reaction to grief and loss began to surface. The extent of her resistance to working through these emotions and how that resistance had resulted in her physical symptoms became very clear to her. Eventually, she went for additional professional training to become a therapist, working with the dying in a hospice program. Preventing grief. From the nature of the processes we've described, it becomes apparent that severe mourning, loss, and the pathological reactions that may ensue may be prevented by early recognition and by preemptive surrender of the associated feelings while they're still mild and can be handled without excessive suffering. As we've seen, the basis of all mourning and loss is attachment, plus the denial of the transitory nature of all relationships. We can begin by looking at our lives, identifying those areas of attachment, and asking ourselves, what internal need is this satisfying? What internal need is my attachment to looking and dressing a certain way, having my hair a certain way, driving a particular kind of car, being with a particular group of people associated with these people, having a particular kind of job, expressing myself in a particular way, to that pet, to that person who I'm kind of clinging to in a way. Like, what emotional need are these things satisfying? What feeling would come up if I had lost all of that, or just one of those things? How can my inner emotional life be balanced so as to decrease the extent, degree, and number of attachments on external objects and people? The greater our attachment to that which is outside of ourselves, the greater is our overall level of fear and vulnerability to loss. We can ask ourselves why we feel so incomplete without all that stuff, even people. Why am I so empty within myself that I have to search for solutions in the form of attachment and dependency on others? We can begin to look at our own inner sense of immaturity, inner areas of immaturity. Specifically, we need to examine, where am I looking to get love rather than to give it? The more loving we are, the less vulnerable we are to grief and loss, and the less we need to seek attachments. When we've acknowledged and let go of all negative feelings, and we've graduated from smallness to the recognition of our greatness, so that our internal joy comes from the pleasure of giving and loving, then we're really invulnerable to loss. When the source of happiness is found within, we are immune to the losses of the world. That's awesome. When we take a critical look at our life, we see all of the attachments and escapes into which we have fallen. Each one represents a potential future source of pain and suffering. The really important areas should be closely examined. Let's take, for example, the failure to face these issues in the commonly seen so-called retirement syndrome. Traditionally, this may occur in women when the job of raising young children comes to an end with their maturity and leaving home, empty nest syndrome. And with a man when he reaches retirement age or loses his job, or through some physical disablement is unable to carry on his previous work. The reaction that typically occurs in middle age is due to the many years of pre-existing denial. There's often a lack of facing the inevitable and making plans for other life activities that would gratify the same inner needs, which in these cases, loss of the job, children leaving home, are feelings of self-esteem, importance, the wanting to feel needed and significant, and to make a contribution and to be productive. Anticipation of the inevitable and preparing for it now bring relatively minor discomfort compared to traumatic grief and loss at a later date. It's much better to surrender these things before they even happen than to wait until you're in the middle of it and it's overwhelming you. You can do it in small parts before it's even happened and become happier right now. We can look at our major love relationships and honestly examine them. To what degree do they subserve our selfish inner needs? To what degree are we really using the other person to exploit them for our own gain? Real talk. To what degree are they merely subserving our happiness? Wow. To find out, all we need to do is ask ourselves, if their happiness were best served by leaving me, how would I feel about that? Like if your best friend, if you knew that your best friend was going to be happier if they just stopped talking to you, how would you feel about that? Or your partner or whoever it is. This reveals the degree to which we're trying to restrict and control the other person, which is attachment and not love. Over 2,000 years ago, the Buddha made the observation that the basis of all human suffering was due to desire and attachment. And human history has merely proven the truth of his teaching. What is the solution to the dilemma? As we can see, it's only the small aspect of oneself that has become attached. The smaller self buys into the frightened, inadequate set of programs that we've unwittingly allowed to run us. The purpose of letting go is to de-energize these programs so they no longer run us. Then we're free to expand into the greater awareness of our higher self. That part of us to which we refer as our greater self loves rather than seeks love. Consequently, there comes the awareness that we are at all times surrounded by love, which is unlimited. We don't have to do anything or go anywhere to get it. It's just all around us and it's inside us. Love is automatically attracted to the person who is loving. By constantly letting go of our negative feelings, we thus cure present pain and prophylactically prevent the occurrence of future pain. Fear is replaced by trust, and with it comes a profound sense of well-being. Immunity to grief of loss occurs when we replace dependence on the small self, the personality, everything that You kind of identify with your thoughts, your feelings, with dependence on the self, the divinity within, self with a capital S, the true self. We look for security to the self, which is eternal, instead of to the small self, which is transitory. It's always temporary. So that's the episode on grief. And I want you to have a look and actually be practical with this. If you've watched this whole video through, awesome. But let's take it a level deeper. What are you most afraid of losing? Who are you most afraid of losing? I can think of a person right now, and I can also feel the emotion behind what happens when I lose, not if, when I lose them. And if you can do that and start doing that in all these different areas of attachment in your life, and if you've watched this whole thing, do yourself this favor and write down, I'm most afraid of losing whatever. If it's just a person or a thing, or even something about yourself, like maybe it's a skill you've got or a great body which you're going to lose as soon as you get to a certain age, it'll all pass away. And write down, how do I feel about that? Scared, afraid, Sit with those feelings, let them come up and accept them. And by doing this, what are you doing? You're putting out the fire before it turns into a forest fire. You're becoming more happy and peaceful now. This is not just about preventing negative feelings in the future. Right now, you can move yourself into higher levels of being, to levels of acceptance and love, simply by doing this exercise. Feel those feelings, write them down. Okay, I accept one day I am going to lose my partner. How does that feel? I accept that one day I'm going to lose both of my parents. How does that feel? My best friend, all my friends, my job. I'm going to lose all social status, any social status I may have. Going to lose my pets, all of it. By facing this, it's like, oh, that sounds depressing. Yeah. Facing your own feelings can be depressing, because guess what? There's depression inside that wants to be felt and wants to be surrendered and released. So go do that exercise. It'll be really powerful. Hope you got some deep truths out of this video that you resonate with. If you're enjoying this series of videos, hit the like button. It means the world to me. No, it doesn't mean the world to me. It's really encouraging to know that something which has inspired me so much is helping you. Leave some comments of, this was challenging, I found this one really difficult, or what about this? What about this situation? And I'll answer those questions. And of course, hit subscribe if you haven't already, so that you can catch all these latest episodes. And I look forward to seeing you on the next video. By the way, we're not getting stuck in grief, not to be a downer. We're moving through the levels. The only way is through. The only way is through surrender. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.